Hey there friends, it's me, Andrea Walford from Make Beautiful Cards. In today's video, I'm going to show you how easy it is to make your own pattern paper using stamps, ink, and cardstock. Now I'm not sure that there's an official name for this, but I'm calling it my Faux Patterned Paper Technique. So why would you want to create your own pattern paper? Well, because sometimes you just need that little something something to spice up your card, and you don't have the right pattern in your stash. Also, because you're creating it yourself, you can customize it to whatever colors your heart desires. So here's what you're going to need for this technique. A stamp set with small images. My new personal go-to favorite is Stampin' Up's Lovely You stamp set because it has a whole bunch of small images that gives you a lot of variety to work with. So I'm going to be using all of these images. The only one I'm not going to use is the one that you see here. Next, you're going to need to choose your ink colors. For today's video, I'm working with some of my absolute favorite colors. First, I have Melon Mambo, and that's for my small flower stamp. Next, I'm going to be using Flirty Flamingo for this larger flower stamp. Mango Melody is going to be for this cute little dual stamp. Granny Apple Green for my leaves. Coastal Cabana for this set of 3 leaves. And then finally, Pretty Peacock for this leaf stem. Finally, you're going to need your paper. Now, I'm going to be using Stampin' Up's regular Whisper White cardstock. Now, although you could keep your sheet intact and stamp on the entire cardstock piece, I find it easier to work in quarters. So what I did was I cut my sheet into 4, and that gives me 4 pieces that are 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. Now, when I'm doing this technique, I will generally create anywhere from 4 to 6 panels. Why? Because inevitably, you're going to muck up. I can't tell you how many times I've messed up my image on the very last stamp. If you have multiple panels, it doesn't matter so much. You have plenty to work with, and you can also always work around the mistakes. Not only that, but with lots of stamp pieces, you have a backup stash that you can draw from when the mood hits you, but you don't have a lot of time to create. So now that you know what we need, let's dive into it. Now for this video, I'm only going to be stamping on one of my panels rather than all 4 because the process is going to be exactly the same. Now, one thing to note when you're doing this, so if you're doing multiple panels, I'm still only completing one at the same time. And that's because I like to stamp my pieces one at a time, and I'm fitting them together kind of like a puzzle. So it's a lot easier than just stamping one image, one image, one image, one image, and you'll see what I mean when we dive into it. So the one that I'm going to start with is my largest flower, and I want to make sure that that's very well inked. So I'm inking that up in my Flirty Flamingo. I have all my ink pads open and lined up with the stamp that I'm going to be using right in front of them. So I'll usually start somewhere towards the center of my piece, and I'll stamp, and then I start fitting my other pieces around it, kind of like a puzzle. There's no right or wrong way to do this. I just look at how the pieces might best tuck into it. So for example, for my leaves, I'm going to ink these up in Granny Apple Green. And you can see in the curve here, this would fit kind of nicely. So I'm going to stamp. And there you can see how nicely that tucked in there. Now in this little space here, this element would fit quite nicely. So I'm going to ink that up. And then stamp. Now I usually like to start off by having one image with each of my colors, or one of every single one of my stamped images, as you can see here. And I think maybe what I'm going to do and then I'll bring this one and I might tuck it around like so. So there you can see I have one of each. From there, I start to look at the different areas and look at what's going to fit. So for example, up here, I might bring in a little bit more green because that would kind of fill out that area. Now when I'm doing this, in order to minimize my muck-ups, generally I will take a quick peek at the back of my stamp just to make sure that everything is well inked. So there you can see how nicely that filled that little area in. Now over here, my little flower would work quite well. So I'm going to stick that there. Then in this area, looking at it, I think this pink flower would probably look quite nice. And then sometimes you'll see me kind of play with the arrangement or play with the orientation. So as you can see, I don't have a specific formula that I'm using. Basically, I'm deciding as I create this on the fly what I think would look best. So see how that's coming together. Now, as I look at this, you can see I've added every single image twice except for my blue one. So I like to make sure that my colors are fairly balanced. So at this point, I'll stop and I'll look and I'll see where I can bring in some more of that blue. And I can see that it would tuck along or around this leaf quite nicely. So as you see, I just add it in like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue filling in this area. So I've sped up the video for you so you don't have to watch this coming together in real time, but I thought I'd take a few minutes just to point a couple of things out that'll make this process a lot easier. So first off, notice how I'm rotating my paper as I'm working. It just makes it a lot easier to get your stamps in the exact position that you want them. The other thing is you'll see that I'm changing the orientation of the stamps. You don't want the individual images all facing in the same direction. By changing the orientation, it creates more of that randomness that you tend to see in patterned paper. Finally, you want to make sure that each of the individual images and colors is spread out throughout the paper. It doesn't matter if it's perfectly or evenly spread out, but you should see the various colors and the various images in each of the sections of the pattern paper. So here you can see what my piece looks like. I think I've gotten a pretty good balance of the different colors and the elements. They're spaced quite nicely together, and I don't really have any muck-ups other than a tiny little bit of that peacock ink seems to have smeared here. Now, in a case like that, I would do one of two things with this panel. I might trim the very edge to cut it off and then just make this a smaller panel. Or if my muck-up was somewhere in the middle, then I would look for a card design that would have an element that would hide whatever my muck-up is. Now, as I look at this, the only thing that I think is that there's a little bit more white space just on this edge than I might like. So in that case, I would look for something that I could fill that in with. And in this case, this little 2-flower stamp might fit the bill. Now there you can see how that looks. A little bit closer to the green than I would have liked, but overall I think it turned out okay. So there you see how you create your own pattern paper. So now that you've created your pattern paper, let me show you a few different ways that you can use it. So you can keep your panel intact like you see in this card. I have the entire panel that I stamped and I place it on my card front, and then you can see here how I embellished it. You can also take your panel and you can die cut it. So here I die cut the panel, and then I used both the die cut and the negative die cut piece. So that turned out pretty cool. And then you can cut up your panel in strips. So remember when I told you sometimes you might get little muck-ups or imperfections? If that happens, cut it up into pieces, and then you can use other elements to hide those imperfections. And here, these 4 cards were all created out of cardstock panels or pattern paper panels that I stamped that had imperfections, and I just created card designs in such a way that they would be hidden. So now that you've learned how to create your own handmade pattern paper and you've seen some ideas on what you can do with it, I hope you have fun and run with this technique. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial, friends, and I will be back soon.